Deposition of Mr. Thomas Aldrich Croft, Land Surveyor, Class 1, Commonwealth Survey Authority of Australia, taken at the offices of the Royal Commission into Maritime Safety and Survey Operations, Cairns, Queensland. Date of deposition, the 14th of August, 1911. Presiding Officer, Commissioner Harold Vane Dutton. Witness present, without legal representation, by his own election. Deposition given under oath. We were 9 men when we went ashore on that island, and we were 6 when the launch reached the ship again, and I will account for every one of the 3 who did not come back, because I believe I am the only living person who can, and because I have been asked to do so by this commission, and because I find that I am no longer able to carry the account privately. I want to begin there. I want to begin with that number, with 9, and with 6. Because everything that follows is a description of what happened to the 3 between them. 2 of those men I watched the island take. One of them I left on that beach of my own choosing, and I will come to that in the proper order, and when I do, I will ask the Commissioner to allow me to finish before he interrupts, because I have rehearsed this account many times in private, and I find that any interruption breaks the thread, and the thread is the only thing I have that approximates a complete record. My name is Thomas Aldrich Croft. I am 34 years of age. I have been employed as a Class 1 surveyor with the Commonwealth Survey Authority since February of 1904, and prior to that I served in a junior capacity with the Queensland Land Survey for 3 years following my qualification. I was appointed as lead surveyor for the Torres Strait Extended Grid project in late 1910, which was my first posting as expedition head rather than subordinate. I held a formal commission from the Hydrographic Branch of the Admiralty, Australian section, for the purposes of that survey work. I was, and remain, a professional. I state this because I am aware of the nature of what I am about to describe, and because I am aware of how it will be received, and because my professional history is the only credential I have to offer this commission, in lieu of corroboration, that I no longer possess. The expedition vessel was the survey schooner Pembury Cross, commanded by Captain Edwin Satterley, who was not among the 9 men who went ashore. Captain Satterley remained aboard with 3 additional crew members while we conducted the landing. He is available to this commission and has, I understand, already given a separate account of what he observed from the anchorage. I have not been shown his account, and I do not know how much of what he observed from 200 yards offshore corresponds to what I observed from the ground, but I am told our accounts are not inconsistent in their major particulars, and I am glad of that, though gladness seems a poor word for it. The 9 men who went ashore were as follows. Myself, as lead surveyor. Mr. Geoffrey Alderton, junior cartographer, 26 years of age, in his first year of fieldwork after completing his qualification in Brisbane. Mr. Alderton was a precise and conscientious young man with a particular aptitude for detail work, and I had found him to be reliable through the 3 weeks of routine survey work that preceded our landing on the island. He was the kind of man who recorded everything, who took measurements twice, who kept his field notes in a hand so neat it looked typeset. I will come to what became of him. I will come to it in the proper order, and I ask the Commissioner to note that I do not intend to avoid it, only to arrive at it with the sequence intact, so that its causes are understood before its outcome is recorded. Mr. Daniel Sue, navigator, seconded from the Pembury Cross for the landing, 41 years of age, a Queenslander by birth, with extensive small craft experience throughout the strait. Sue was the senior man in terms of years, though my commission gave me final authority on survey decisions. He was not a scientist and did not pretend to be. He was a practical man whose primary concern, stated plainly and without apology from the first day we worked together, was returning everyone to the ship alive. I want to record that. I wanted in the transcript that Daniel Sue's primary concern was returning everyone alive, because what happened later cannot be properly understood without understanding what kind of man he was, and what kind of men we disagreed about being. Mr. Reneng Taba was our interpreter, a Saibai man of perhaps 35 years who had worked with survey parties before and who spoke English with considerable fluency, as well as several island dialects of the Strait. He had been recommended to us by the Saibai Island Mission as the man most familiar with the outer island groups and their navigational approaches. I will say now, and I will say it plainly, that Mr. Taba knew something about the island we were going to before we went there, and that he told me something of it, and that I did not respond to that information with the seriousness it deserved. That failure is mine. I recorded it as cultural material in my preliminary notes, and I placed it in the same category as the ordinary reservoir of local superstition that attaches itself to remote coastlines throughout the region, and that categorization was an error of professional judgment for which I carry full responsibility. The remaining 5 were survey assistants and a camp cook, men whose names are in my formal expedition log, which has been submitted to this commission, but whom I will not single out here, except to record that all 5 returned to the ship, which is a fact I do not know whether to call fortunate or a function of where each man happened to be standing on the morning of the 4th day. They were good men, doing their jobs. What happened was not the result of anything they did. I will now give my account of events in chronological order. I will state what I observed. I will state what I heard. I will state what I measured where measurement was possible. I will state what conclusions I drew from those observations and measurements, understanding that this commission may find those conclusions difficult to accept. I drew them only after I had exhausted every alternative explanation I could construct, and I drew them reluctantly, and I drew them because they were the only conclusions that fit every element of what I observed, which is what surveyors do. We fit conclusions to complete data, rather than to comfortable subsets of it. The island first appeared on our survey record on the morning of the 8th of March, 1911, when we were running a sounding line approximately 42 nautical miles beyond the outermost point of the established survey grid, in sea that the existing Admiralty chart recorded as open water of 35 to 40 fathoms depth. The island was not on that chart. It was not on any chart I had ever consulted. It presented as a low coral formation rising perhaps 15 feet at its highest point above sea level, perhaps 1.5 miles in diameter at its widest east to west extent, with dense inland vegetation suggesting fresh water access somewhere in the interior. Captain Satterley initially proposed we log it and continue, noting that uncharted shoal formations in the strait were not unusual, and that charting it formally was technically within our mandate, but not within our primary assignment. I disagreed. I pointed out that a formation of this size at this depth was not a simple shoal, that it warranted formal survey, and that leaving it uncharted represented a navigational hazard to any vessel running that track. Satterley accepted my assessment. We anchored 200 yards off the eastern shore and prepared the landing party. I asked Mr. Taba that evening, while we were checking equipment, whether he knew the island by any name or description. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. He told me the Saibai fishermen called it something that did not translate precisely, but that the nearest translation was something like, "the place that answers back." He said that fishermen from the outer islands had avoided it for at least 2 generations, and that he had never spoken to anyone who had landed there. I asked him whether he knew why it was avoided. He said that the old men on Saibai said the island was occupied by something very old that did not share its ground. He used the phrase, "does not share," and I noted it at the time as an interesting locution, a marker of territorial behavior attributed to whatever the local tradition held was there. I recorded it in my preliminary notes under cultural observations, local avoidance law, territorial attribution, probable historical incident of unknown nature. I wrote it in that form and I moved on to checking the theodolite calibration. I ask this commission to note that Renang Taba is one of the 2 men who did not leave the island. I ask the commission to note that he told me what he knew as clearly as he was able, and that I classified it as folklore and moved on to my equipment. I have thought about that exchange every day since the 14th of March, which is when we reached Cairns. I have thought about it most often in the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning, which is when I do most of my thinking now. We made landfall on the morning of the 9th of March. The sea was calm, the sky overcast but not threatening, the air warm and carrying a salt smell that was ordinary for the strait in that season. We rowed the launch through a gap in the coral reef on the eastern face, pulled it above the tide line, and made our first camp at the edge of the beach, perhaps 20 yards from the tree line. The vegetation inland was dense, predominantly pandanus and mangrove species, transitioning to something more varied further in, consistent with the kind of low coral island formation common throughout the Torres Strait, but larger and more internally varied than most formations of that type. There was fresh water, as I had expected. A small brackish spring about 300 yards inland that Mr. Alderton located within the first 2 hours of our arrival, which confirmed the island could sustain a working camp. We spent the first morning in routine survey work, establishing our baseline measurement, setting reference marks, beginning the coastal circumference traverse. I want to be clear that the first day was ordinary. The work was straightforward. The island was quiet, in a way that I noted but did not then find alarming, a particular quality of stillness that I attributed to the absence of bird populations, which I did find mildly unusual but not inexplicable. Coral islands in the strait often support substantial seabird colonies, terns and frigate birds and boobies in considerable numbers, and the absence of any such colony on a formation of this size was notable. But islands with significant ground-level predator populations, pythons, monitor lizards, feral cats introduced by fishing parties, often show depleted bird populations, and I filed the absence under that heading and continued with the traverse. It was late in the first afternoon, when Mr. Alderton and I were pushing the survey line into the interior toward the approximate center of the island, that we found the first tracks. I want to describe them precisely, because the precise description is important, and because I spent considerable time with them. They were bipedal impressions pressed into a soft substrate of decomposed coral and organic material in a shallow depression about 150 yards inside the tree line. The impressions were elongated, consistent in general form with a broad human foot, but large, very large, each one measuring between 28 and 31 inches from heel to the forward extent of the toes, with individual toe impressions distinct and deep, suggesting considerable body weight, distributed over a wide plantar surface. I measured 6 consecutive impressions and recorded the stride length between them at between 8 feet 3 inches and 9 feet 1 inch. The depth of the impressions in that substrate suggested a weight I am not comfortable estimating without reference to comparative data I did not then have and do not now have. But the substrate that held those prints was firm enough that I myself, standing and walking across it, left prints no deeper than a 1/4 inch. The impressions I was measuring were between 2 and 3 inches deep. I called Mr. Alderton over and asked him what he made of them. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he said he wanted to measure them again himself, and he did, and he came back with numbers consistent with mine. I asked him again what he made of them, and he said, very carefully, that he did not know. I did not know either. A crocodile large enough to produce substrate disturbance of that magnitude might conceivably produce an impression that could be misread as bipedal if the animal had been moving in an unusual posture, but the stride pattern was wrong for any reptilian gait I could construct in my mind, and the distribution across the individual impressions suggested a consistent upright posture over the full span of the trackway, not an intermittent one. Mr. Alderton photographed the impressions with the expedition camera, a 1/4-plate Sanderson field camera that we had brought for documenting survey markers. Those photographs were on the glass plates that were submitted with this deposition. I asked the commission to confirm they were received. We completed the day's survey work and returned to camp. I did not tell the rest of the party about the tracks that evening. I discussed them privately with Mr. Alderton, who agreed that we should continue methodically and gather more information before drawing any conclusions that might disrupt the expedition's work. I also discussed them with Mr. Taba, separately, after the others had settled for the night. I described the dimensions to him, and I watched his face as I described them. He did not look surprised. He looked, if I am reading his expression correctly in retrospect, as though I had confirmed something he had already expected. I asked him whether the tracks corresponded to what the old men on Saibai had described. He said that the old men had not described tracks specifically. He said the old men had described a presence. He said there was a difference between those two things, and that the presence was the part that mattered. I asked him what he meant by presence. He thought for a moment, and then he said that the old men's word for the thing on this island was not a word for an animal. It was a word used for something that knew you were there. I wrote that in my personal field notes that evening, which are also submitted to this commission. Something that knew you were there. I wrote it, and I underlined it once, which in my note-keeping practice indicates a detail I consider potentially significant. I underline things fairly rarely. I underlined that. The percussion began that night. I was awake, making a final check of my equipment, when I heard it for the first time. It came from somewhere inland and elevated, from the island's highest point, which was roughly 1.5 miles from the camp on a bearing of approximately northwest, and it was, as I will attempt to describe it as accurately as I can, a hollow, rhythmic impact sound, as though something very large and very hard were being struck against something resonant. Not a crack and not a knock. Something deeper than both, with a vibration that carried through the air rather than through the ground. A tone rather than a percussion in the strictly mechanical sense. Low, slow. Spaced at intervals, I later timed at approximately 8 to 9 seconds between each repetition. I sat still and listened to it for perhaps 3 minutes. Then I woke Mr. Su, who was sleeping nearest to me. He came awake quickly, the way practical men in the field do, and he listened for about 30 seconds without moving. Then he said it was probably a large hollow tree being worked by wind. I considered that. The air was calm that night, and wind in hollow wood tends to be variable in rhythm, responsive to the irregularity of natural air movement, and what I was hearing was not variable. It was metronomic, but I accepted his alternative explanation for the purposes of getting through the night without alarming the camp, and I filed it alongside the bird absence and the tracks in the growing column of noted anomalies that I had not yet found a way to connect. It stopped after perhaps 40 minutes and did not resume that night. I eventually slept. The second day we pushed the survey further inland, running 2 parallel transects that would allow us to map the central elevation and the distribution of the fresh water. The work was harder going than the coastal traverse, the vegetation thicker, the ground less stable in places, and the temperature markedly higher once we were inside the canopy. We moved as a team of 4 on the interior work, myself, Alderton, Taba, and one of the assistants, a man named Connors who was steady and undemonstrative and good with the survey rod. I want to mention the survey rod because it becomes important, and I want the commission to understand what it is. A graduated staff used in leveling work, typically made of hardwood with brass fittings at the intervals, 2 inches in diameter, about 11 feet long, used as a sighting reference for the theodolite. We carried 2 of them on the interior transects. We were perhaps a mile inland when Taba stopped walking. He stopped so abruptly that Connors nearly walked into him. I came alongside and looked at what he was looking at. There was a second survey rod, vertical in the ground, perhaps 40 yards ahead of us in a small clearing. I say second rod because my first thought was that it was one of ours, that someone from the camp had come ahead of us, that something had been left behind from an earlier traverse. But I had both our rods with me, and I could see immediately when I approached it that this rod was not one I recognized. It was not new. It was weathered and darkened, but it was a commercial surveying rod of the kind in use in this region, and it was standing perfectly vertical in the coral substrate, planted there, and its brass fittings were gone. Not rusted away. The fittings had been attached with bolts at the standard intervals, and those bolts were still present, the holes still clear, but the brass itself, the casings and the graduated plates, and the level vials, had been removed or destroyed. The wood at those points showed fresh splintering, as though the fittings had been gripped and twisted with considerable force rather than unscrewed. There was no manufacturer's mark I could find anywhere on the rod. I examined it carefully. The wood was of a species I did not recognize, though it was close in grain to the hardwood used for commercial rods of that period. I could not determine with certainty whether this was an expedition rod or something locally manufactured to a similar pattern. What I could determine with certainty was that it had been placed in that location, deliberately vertical, and that the brass fittings had been removed by force. I pulled it from the ground with some effort. The wood was seated perhaps 8 inches into the substrate, and I carried it back with me. That evening I showed it to the full party. I described where we had found it and the condition of the fittings. There was no good explanation for its presence offered by anyone, including the men who had been with me when I found it. Connors said he thought someone must have been here before us, some other survey party, which was the only practical explanation I had also considered. I noted that the island was on no chart, and that no survey expedition I was aware of had a record of visiting it, but that the absence of a record did not mean the island had never been visited. That remained my working position. I kept the rod. I will come to what happened to that rod. But I need to say first that keeping it was a decision, and that I was aware when I made it that it was not simply an administrative decision about expedition materials. Something in me, the surveyor in me perhaps, or perhaps just the stubbornness peculiar to men who spend their lives measuring things, did not want to leave it there. I had found it. I had measured it and examined it, and had not been able to account for it. Taking it felt like taking the problem with me to a place where I could continue working on it. I understand now that this was not the right frame for the situation, but I understand it now, from this chair, with the events behind me. I did not understand it then. The percussion returned on the second night, and it was closer. I had gone to sleep with the determination to time it precisely if it began again, and I did. I lay awake for perhaps an hour before the first repetition reached us, and when it came, I had my watch in my hand. The interval between repetitions was consistent, 8 seconds, with a variability of perhaps half a second either way. What was different from the first night was the source. On the first night, the sound had come from the interior, from the elevated center of the island, distant enough that it was primarily a sound and only faintly a sensation. On the second night, it was closer. I estimated perhaps a quarter-mile nearer to the camp than the previous night, and I could feel it this time. Not through the ground, through the air. A pressure in the chest with each repetition, brief, not painful, but unmistakable, the kind of sensation you notice more when you focus on it, less when you are distracted by other things. It woke Mr. Sue, and it woke 2 of the assistants. Sue came to me and asked whether I was hearing it, and I told him yes, and he asked what I thought it was. I told him I did not know. He asked whether we should consider leaving. I told him that leaving on the basis of an unidentified sound was premature. He did not argue, but he did not go back to sleep either. He sat with his back against the camp chest, and he listened, and I lay there and I timed each repetition against the second hand of my watch, and I wondered whether the interval was decreasing or whether I was only hoping it was not. It stopped after approximately 90 minutes, closer to 2 hours, based on my timing. I slept for perhaps 3 hours. The third day I made an error. I want to record it precisely because it is central to what happened afterward. I decided to extend the interior transect toward the elevated center of the island, from which the percussion seemed to originate. My stated reason, which I gave to the full party, was that the survey work required it, that completing a topographic record of the island's central elevation was part of the formal survey mandate, and that this was accurate. The survey work did require it. But I am giving sworn testimony, and I will record that the survey work was not my only reason. I wanted to see the source. I wanted to find whatever it was that was making that sound, and measure it, and put a rational description on it. because the irrational description was gathering weight in my mind, and I found that intolerable. A man who measures things for a living finds unexplained things genuinely painful in a way that is difficult to communicate to people who do not share the disposition. The not knowing was worse than any known explanation I could generate. I believe that now. I believed a version of it then, imprecisely, and I acted on it. Sue objected. He said plainly that he thought we should complete what we had and return to the ship. We had enough survey data for a preliminary chart, he said, enough to put the island on the record and note it for a formal follow-up expedition. He said we did not need the interior elevation to accomplish the primary purpose, which was accurate, and that remaining to get it introduced an unnecessary delay for uncertain benefit, which was also accurate. We argued for perhaps 20 minutes, the full party present and listening, and I am not proud of the argument or of the way I conducted it. I outranked him in terms of survey authority, and I used that rank to conclude the argument rather than resolve it. I told him the decision was mine to make, and that I had made it. He accepted this. He did not stop being right about it. We pushed the interior transect to within about 400 yards of the island's central point. The terrain had changed noticeably. The vegetation was denser, the canopy higher, and there was a quality to the light inside that canopy, a green-tinged, filtered dimness that was disorienting in a way I cannot fully account for in optical terms. Sounds felt different inside that section of the island, slightly muffled, as though the canopy were absorbing them. The air smelled different. I want to describe that smell because it recurred and because the Commission may consider it evidentially relevant. It was a salt smell, but not the clean salt smell of the open sea, something lower in character, something with a depth to it that brought to mind organic decay and also heat, the specific smell of something burnt and wet at the same time. I had smelled something like it near a seabird rookery once, after a grass fire had moved through it, the smell of scorched feathers and salt water, and the particular organic richness of a colony's accumulated waste. That is the closest analogy I have. It was not a pleasant smell, and it was intermittent, present, and then absent, as though it came and went with some movement of air that we could not detect directly. Taba had been quiet all morning. He was not a quiet man in general. He talked while he worked, identifying plants by their local names, noting navigational references from the tree canopy, translating bird calls into their local names, and telling me what different species calls were considered to signify in island reading. On that morning he was not doing any of those things. He was walking, and he was watching the interior of the canopy with a focus that I noted but did not address until mid-morning, when I came alongside him during a rest stop and asked him directly whether something was wrong. He told me that the island was listening to us. I asked him to explain what he meant by that. He said that when you are on an island or in a forest that has large animals in it, the birds and the smaller creatures know about the animals and their movement, and they talk about it, and if you know how to listen to them, you can hear where the animal is and how it is moving. He said that on this island, there were no birds making those sounds, no calls, no movement noise, nothing, and he said that the absence was not because the island was empty of birds. He said the absence was because the birds knew something was near that was too large to comment on. He said, "Everything here is very quiet because everything here is afraid." I wrote that in my field notes. That is a direct quotation, and I have reproduced it as accurately as my memory allows. I wrote it during the next measurement interval, which was perhaps 3 minutes later. It is in the field notes submitted to this commission. I pushed the transect to its planned extent, and we took our measurements, and I collected the data I had come for, and we returned to camp. The data was good. The topographic record of the central elevation is part of the formal survey report I submitted to the survey authority, though I understand that report is now under administrative review, pending the outcome of this inquiry. On the return to camp, I kept thinking about what Taba had said, and about the quality of the silence in that inner section of the island, which I had noted myself, and had attributed to the dense canopy absorbing sound. I am a precise man. I do not like revising descriptions retroactively to fit a subsequent narrative. But I will say that by the time we reached camp that afternoon, I had begun to consider the possibility that my attribution was not complete. That evening, I examined the recovered survey rod again. I was sitting outside the camp with it across my knees, and Alderton came and sat beside me and asked whether I had any better theory about it. I told him no. He sat with me for a while, and then he said, very quietly, that he had been thinking about the tracks we had found on the first day, and that he had been trying to construct an alternative identification for the organism that made them, and that he could not make any of the alternatives work. He ran through the list. Large crocodile, large monitor lizard, a dugong that had come ashore in some aberrant behavior, a human with some extreme pathological size condition. He said each one failed on the physical evidence. He said the stride interval alone eliminated every quadruped he could think of, and the toe impression depth and spread eliminated any human morphology he was aware of. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he thought we should leave in the morning. He said it calmly and without dramatics, the way he said everything, and it was the clearest and most plainly stated position anyone on the expedition had taken, and I thanked him for saying it, and I told him I would consider it overnight. I want the commission to know that I did consider it. I lay awake for some time after the camp had settled, and I genuinely considered the question of whether to break camp and return to the ship in the morning. I constructed the arguments on both sides. We had the central elevation data. We had the coastal traverse completed to roughly 70%. We had the anomalous tracks photographed and measured. We had the recovered rod as a physical artifact. We had enough for a preliminary chart and a substantial anomaly report. Against that, I set the professional obligation to complete the survey to the standard the Admiralty Commission required, which meant finishing the coastal traverse and establishing the final reference marks, a task I estimated at another full day of work. I did not want to submit an incomplete survey. I am aware of how that sounds in the context of everything that followed. I resolved to complete the coastal traverse the following day, working quickly, and to have the party aboard the ship by evening. The percussion began that night at what I estimated from the stars as approximately 11 in the evening. I did not sleep before it began. When the first repetition reached the camp, I sat up immediately and checked my watch. 8 seconds between repetitions, the same interval as the previous nights, the same slow metronomic spacing, but the sound this time was close enough that I could not pretend it was coming from the island's center. It was coming from the tree line, from the darkness just beyond the edge of the vegetation, perhaps 60 to 80 yards from where we had set our camp. I did not need to wake Sue or the others. The sound woke them. We sat in silence in the camp, all 9 of us, and we listened to it move, because it moved. Over the course of perhaps an hour and a half, the repetitions traced an arc from roughly northwest of the camp, around toward the north, and then toward the northeast, as though whatever was producing them was moving along the tree line in a wide, slow circuit, keeping the open beach between itself and us, but maintaining a distance that grew no greater than it was when it had started. I timed it throughout. The interval did not change. 8 seconds, steady as a clock. None of us slept. We sat and we listened and we did not speak much. Connors, at some point in the middle of the progression, asked me in a low voice whether I thought it was something large. I told him yes. He asked whether I thought it was coming toward us. I told him that based on the arc it appeared to be circling rather than approaching. This was accurate, and it was also, I recognized, a way of answering his question that emphasized the less alarming of the available interpretations. Something else happened that third night that I should record precisely. At some point during the arc, approximately when the source of the sound was at its closest to the camp as I estimated, I became aware of a smell. The same smell from the interior transect that afternoon, low tide and burnt organic matter, the seabird rookery smell. It was brief, present for perhaps 2 or 3 of the repetitions and then gone. I noted the direction from which it came, northwest of our position, consistent with the sound location at that moment. I recorded it in my field notes by lamplight. Smell, northwest bearing, consistent with interior transect sample, brief, 2 to 3 minutes duration. Third night, approximately midnight. The sound moved on, continuing its arc, and then stopped. It did not fade in the way natural sounds fade with distance. It simply stopped, mid-arc, as though a decision had been made. I noted the stopping point on my mental map of the island, approximately due north of the camp, and I noted the time, which was approximately 25 past midnight by my watch. I will tell the commission what I thought in those minutes after it stopped. I thought, whatever that is, it has been watching us since we arrived, and it has been coming closer in measured stages, and tonight it circled us, and it stopped where it could observe the camp from directly behind the tree line at the north, and it is still there. I thought that with a clarity and a certainty that I cannot fully attribute to evidence. There was evidence, but the certainty was in excess of the evidence. It was the kind of certainty that the body produces before the mind has finished adding the numbers. I thought that, and then I thought about the tracks, 28 to 31 inches, stride of 8 to 9 feet, substrate impression depth that I could not account for without a body weight well beyond any known animal in the region. And then I thought about whether the 5 survey assistants and the cook and Alderton and Sue and Taba would still be alive if I ordered the party to stay another day. I did not order an immediate departure that night. I have asked myself many times why I did not, and the honest answer is that I was still, even then, in the grip of the professional habit that says, do not act on incomplete information. Measure twice. The sound had stopped. The camp was intact. No one had been harmed. Departing at midnight from an unfamiliar anchorage on a dark sea through a coral reef gap we had only navigated once would introduce its own risks. I told myself these things, and some of them were true, and they were also the things I told myself because I wanted them to be true. At first light on the 4th day, I told Sue that we would pack the camp and depart. We would not complete the coastal traverse. I told him we had enough data for the preliminary chart, and that I was authorizing an early conclusion to the survey. He did not say I told you so, which I respected then and respect now. He simply began organizing the loading of the equipment without another word. What I did not anticipate was Alderton. Alderton came to me while we were packing and said that we were close enough to completing the coastal traverse, that it would take no more than 3 hours, and that completing it would substantially improve the value of the survey work, and that we had come this far, and that the night's events, while disturbing, had not resulted in any harm to the party, and that he thought we should finish what we had started. I want to be fair to him. He was right about the scientific value. He was a cartographer to his core, and he was looking at an incomplete chart, and he was telling me what his training said, which was the same thing my training was telling me, and I had already decided against both of our trainings, and I should have held that decision. But I did not hold it. I told Sue we would do a final 3-hour traverse to complete the coastal record, and then load everything and go. Sue looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, 3 hours, not 4, 3. I told him 3. We worked quickly. Alderton and I ran the final section of the coastal traverse, with Taba and 2 of the assistants carrying the equipment. We completed the eastern section and worked our way around the northern face of the island, and the work went well. The measurements were clean, and by the middle of the 2nd hour, I thought we were going to close the traverse and get everyone out without incident. The sun was up, the sky was clear, and the ordinary daylight weight of the place was easier to carry than the nighttime version had been, which is its own kind of error. The things that feel less frightening in daylight are not less frightening. They are only less visible. It was Taba who stopped first, again. We were perhaps 200 yards along the northern face, working in among the coastal pandanus, when he stopped and stood very still, and I saw his face. He was looking inland, toward the tree line, toward the dense, dark internal canopy that ran 40 or 50 yards above us from the beach. I followed his gaze. I will describe what I saw with the same precision I have tried to apply to everything else in this account, because precision is the only honesty I have available to me, and I will not compromise it. I will state what I observed. There was something standing at the edge of the tree line. It was upright. It was on two legs. I want to be clear about that, because it is the element of the description most likely to be questioned. It was not a quadruped, I have mistaken for a biped. It was not a tree, I have mistaken for a figure. It was not a trick of light and canopy. It was standing on two legs in an upright posture, and its head was visible above the top of the coastal pandanus, which I estimate at approximately 10 to 12 feet in height on that section of the coast. It was taller than the top of those trees. I estimated its height at between 14 and 16 feet. I am a professional surveyor. Estimating heights and distances is my specific professional competency. I am giving this commission my professional estimate. The object I observed standing at the edge of the tree line on the north face of the island on the morning of the 12th of March, 1911, was standing upright on two legs and was between 14 and 16 feet tall. Its color was pale, not white, not the pure white of bleached coral, but the off-white of old bone or of the underside of a large marine animal, a dugong or a sea turtle, a pale that suggested something that spent significant time underwater or out of direct sun. Its surface texture at that distance appeared smooth. I could not see fine detail at 200 yards, but I could see the general impression of the head, which was large and proportionally wider at the base than at the crown, and the shoulders, which were heavy, and the arms, which were long enough that I remember noting, in the strange calm that sometimes comes with extreme stress, that the proportional arm length was different from what I would expect for a biped of that height. It was not moving. It was standing, and it was watching us. I was certain of that. The attention was palpable in the way that very few things in a lifetime are palpable. It was looking at us the way a man looks at something he has already decided what to do with. I said, very quietly, to Taba and to Alderton, and to the two assistants with us, "We are going to move to the beach, slowly, and we are going to begin walking back toward the camp, and we are not going to run." I said it quietly because I did not want the sound to carry, and I said it with as much steadiness as I could manufacture, and I can tell you that the steadiness was entirely manufactured and had nothing underneath it. Taba was already moving. He did not need my instruction. He had moved to the beach side of the pandanus before I finished speaking. We began to walk. I kept my eyes on the tree line. The thing at the tree line did not move. We had covered perhaps 50 yards when I heard it. The percussion. A single repetition. One hollow impact. Close. So close that the pressure in my chest was immediate and involuntary. A physical response that operated completely below the level of decision. Not from the tree line ahead. From behind me. From the section of coast we had just walked away from. Between us and the camp. I did not stop walking. I turned as I walked and I looked back. The northern face of the island behind us was empty. Whatever had made that single sound was in the vegetation, not visible. I turned forward again. The thing at the tree line was no longer standing where it had been. The space at the canopy edge was empty. I said to walk faster. I will not describe the walk back to the camp in detail, because my memory of it is compressed in the way that memories of extreme stress are compressed, not fragmented. I remember it, but the time inside it is wrong. The 40 or 50 seconds it took feels shorter than it was, and longer than it was simultaneously. What I remember clearly is reaching the edge of the main camp clearing and seeing Sue and the others already there, and already alert, because the percussion sound had carried to the camp, and they had heard it, and Sue had the men up and in motion. Sue looked at me, and I looked at Sue, and he said, "Now." I said yes. I said yes, and I turned to tell Alderton and Taba and the two assistants behind me to keep moving toward the launch, and that is when the creature came out of the tree line at the western edge of the camp. It had not been where I had seen it, or it had moved. In the time it took us to walk from the northern face to the camp, a distance of perhaps 200 yards, it had moved to the western edge of the main clearing, and it came out of the vegetation there, and it walked into the camp. The word "walked" is technically accurate, and I will record it. It walked. 3 strides from the tree line to the camp's center, each stride covering the distance I had measured between the trackway prints. 8 to 9 feet. 3 strides, and it was standing in the middle of our camp, among our equipment and our provisions, and the fire we had kept burning since the first night. 3 strides and it was there, and it was not distant and indistinct as it had been at the tree line. It was present, it was close, and I could see it clearly. I will describe it. I will not attempt to identify it. I will describe what I observed. It was approximately the height I had estimated, 14 feet, possibly more. The pale color was consistent with my observation from the tree line, the off-white of old bone, covering a surface that at this distance I could see more clearly. The skin, if skin is the right word, had a quality of roughness in places. A texture that was not smooth as I had initially thought, but differentiated. Smooth in some areas and rougher in others, the way a large marine animal's surface varies between regions. The head was large, as I had noted, wide at the jaw and narrowing at the crown, with features I will attempt to describe, though my confidence in this part of the description is lower because my ability to focus on the face specifically was compromised by the context. The eyes were set wide and were pale, a color I cannot name precisely. Not white, not the absence of color, but pale in the way that light seen through a depth of water is pale. The mouth was wide, the nose was flat. The overall impression of the face was of something that had been organized along broadly similar lines to a human face, but that was not a human face, in any meaningful sense. It was, to borrow Taba's language, and I think he would forgive me for doing so, something organized on different principles. The arms were long. I had noticed this from the tree line, and I noted it again here, closely. The arms hung nearly to the knee when relaxed. The hands were large, proportionally very large, and the fingers were long, and there was something about the hand structure at the junction of the palm and the fingers that was not quite the same as a human hand, but that I could not describe more precisely then and cannot now. It stood in the center of the camp, and it did not move for a moment, that felt much longer than it was. And then it looked at me, specifically at me, not at the camp generally, not at the group. It looked at me with the same directness and the same quality of attention that I had felt from 200 yards, and that was, from 15 yards, an entirely different experience. I have been looked at in my life by people who intended me harm. I have been looked at by men in positions of authority over me. I have been looked at by animals in the field. None of those experiences prepared me for what it felt like to be looked at by this thing, which was less like being observed and more like being assessed, more like being identified in the way that a collector identifies a specimen, with the particular attention of something that has seen many things and is placing you in a category. I understood then, standing in my own camp with the survey rod I had taken from its island in my hand because I had picked it up when we ran, that it knew I had the rod. I cannot explain how I knew that it knew. I cannot produce evidence for it. But I believed it then with a certainty I still believe it with now. I had taken something from this island, and it had come to collect on that. What happened next happened in a span of perhaps 30 seconds, and I will try to record it in the order it occurred. Sue had the launch party moving toward the beach, which was behind me and to my right, perhaps 120 yards. He had been moving them as quietly and quickly as possible while the creature was focused on the camp, and most of the party was already between me and the beach. Alderton was beside me, Taba was behind me, and slightly to my left. The 2 assistants who had been with us on the traverse were moving with Sue's group. The creature stepped forward, not quickly, 1 step, toward me, toward the rod. The ground shook with a small perceptible tremor from the weight of that step, and I felt it through my boots, and in the same moment the percussion sound came again, not from a distance this time, not from the tree line or the interior, but from the creature itself, a single deep hollow impact that had no point of origin I could identify, that seemed to come from somewhere inside its chest or from the air immediately around it, and the pressure of it hit me in the sternum, and I took a step back involuntarily. I dropped the survey rod. I placed it. More accurately, I set it on the ground between us, and I took 3 steps back, and I turned, and I said to Alderton and Taba, "Run." Alderton ran. Taba did not run. He walked, quickly, but he walked, and he was speaking in what I recognized as his island dialect, not to me but toward the creature, speaking steadily and quietly as he walked, and the creature watched him, and the creature did not come after us. We reached the beach. Sue and most of the party were at the launch. I ran the last 40 yards to the waterline and I looked back. Alderton was behind me, 10 yards, running. Taba was behind Alderton, 40 yards further back, still walking and still speaking. The launch had been run to the waterline and was ready to push off. There were 7 of us at the beach, and the launch could carry all 9 and then some. It was not a capacity problem. It was never a capacity problem. The creature came out of the tree line at the top of the beach. It did not run. It walked. 3 strides from the vegetation edge to the open beach, covering the same ground we had just covered in a sprint. It did not make the percussion sound again. It walked, and it stood at the top of the beach, perhaps 90 yards from the waterline, and it looked at the launch and at the people around it. Alderton reached me. I grabbed his arm and I pulled him toward the launch. I looked back at Taba, who had stopped walking and was standing on the beach between the creature and the waterline, still speaking, 40 yards from us and 40 yards from the creature. I shouted his name. He looked at me over his shoulder. I shouted that we had to go. "Come now." And he looked at me for a moment, and then he looked up at the creature, and he said something in his dialect that I could not hear over the distance and the sound of the surf. Then he looked back at me again. I will record precisely what happened next. Sue had his hands on the launch, and he was looking at me, and he said, quietly and very clearly, "She goes now, Thomas. She has to go now." I looked at Taba. I looked at Sue. I looked at Taba again. Taba was 40 yards away, and the creature was 40 yards in the other direction, and there were 6 men in a launch that needed to be in the water, and I had, in that moment, about 3 seconds before the decision made itself. I helped Sue push the launch off. I want to be precise about this because I will not have the commission believe it was made by anyone other than me. Sue made his assessment and stated it. I made the final decision. I put my hands on the launch, and I pushed it into the water, and I climbed in with the others, and we rowed. I rowed with my back to the beach, and I heard the percussion once behind me, one deep hollow impact that moved through the water and through the hull of the launch, and up through the wood into my hands, and I kept rowing. I looked back once when we had covered perhaps 30 yards. Taba was standing on the beach, looking at us. The creature was behind him, at the top of the beach, and it was still. Neither of them was moving. They were standing on the beach in the morning light, 40 yards apart, looking at the launch, and the surf was white behind them. I did not see what happened after that. I turned around and rowed. I should record, for completeness, what happened to Alderton. Alderton was in the launch. He was seated at the bow. When we had cleared the reef gap and were in open water, perhaps 50 yards from the reef, he said that we had left Taba. I told him yes. He said we had to go back. I told him we could not. He was quiet for a moment, and then he stood up in the launch. He was not panicked. He was not irrational. He was the same precise and careful young man he had always been. And he stood up in the bow of the launch, and he looked back at the island, and he said, "I am not leaving him." He went over the side. He was a capable swimmer. The water was calm. I turned the launch immediately. We rowed back toward him. He was swimming toward the reef gap, and I was behind him in the launch, and I was closing the distance, and I thought we had him. The percussion came from the island. Not one repetition, several in rapid succession, not the 8-second interval but faster, a series of 3 or 4 closely spaced impacts that came across the water and hit the launch and hit the water around us, and I saw Alderton, in the water ahead of me, stop swimming. He stopped, and he floated on his back, and he looked up at the sky, and I saw him clearly, from perhaps 15 yards. Then he turned in the water, and he began swimming toward the reef gap again, away from the launch. I called to him. He did not stop. He reached the reef, and he went through the gap and into the water on the island side. And I could not follow with the launch without grounding it on the coral, and I did not follow without the launch, and he did not come back. And I cannot tell you what happened to him after he cleared the reef gap, because I do not know. We rowed to the Pembury Cross. Captain Satterley brought us up, and the launch was secured, and we got underway. He has described what he observed from the anchorage in his separate account, and I will not attempt to summarize it. I was not capable of providing a coherent account to Satterley immediately after we boarded. I understand from the ship's log that I was incoherent for some period of time, and that the ship's mate administered something to help me sleep, which I did not feel I needed, and which was probably correct. We reached Cairns on the 14th of March. I gave an initial account to the harbour master's office, and was subsequently directed to give this formal deposition. In the interim period between arrival and this deposition, I have written the full expedition report that has been submitted to the Survey Authority. I have provided the recovered glass plate negatives to the Royal Survey Authority's Physical Records Office, and I have submitted the recovered survey rod, the one I found in the island's interior and carried back and set down on the beach before the creature, to the Commission as physical evidence. I understand the rod has been examined by the Commission's materials officer. I would like to record that I recovered that rod from the beach during the departure, that in the confusion and the rowing and the climbing into the launch, I still had it with me, and that I did not set it down on the beach as I intended. I set it down in the moment of confrontation, and then I picked it up again when we ran, and I carried it to the launch without thinking about it, the way you carry things you are holding when you run. I have asked myself whether I should have left it on the beach, whether leaving it might have changed what happened to Alderton and to Taba, whether that was the last thing still owed, and I kept it. I do not know the answer to that. I have thought about it every day since we reached Cairns, and I still do not know. I want to address the question of what I believe the creature was, because I understand the Commission requires it. I do not know what it was. I will say what it was not. It was not a known animal. It was not a saltwater crocodile, which is the largest fauna in the region, and which reaches lengths of up to 17 feet, but which is a quadruped and a reptile, and does not stand upright to a height of 14 feet in a clearing. It was not a large primate. There are no great apes native to Australia or the Torres Strait. It was not a large marine mammal that had come ashore. It was not a hallucination shared by 9 men, 5 of whom subsequently confirmed aspects of the visual account to Captain Satterley, whose deposition is also before this commission. I will note what I know about the island's history as far as I could determine it. The recovered survey rod is not mine. It is not from any survey expedition I can identify in the Survey Authority's records. The brass fittings were removed with a force consistent with very large hands, if hands is the right word for what I am describing, and not with a tool. The tracks I measured on the first day of the survey correspond in every measured dimension to the size and stride of the creature I subsequently observed at close range. The percussion sound was produced by the creature, or by the creature's presence, in ways I cannot fully account for technically, but which in retrospect appear to have been deliberate, to have served as a means of marking approach, of announcing presence at measured distances, advancing in stages toward the camp over the course of 3 nights. Whether that advancing was a warning or a preparation for what happened on the 4th morning, I cannot say with certainty, but the pattern was consistent with deliberate, purposeful behavior, not with the random movement of an animal. I took something from its island. I did not know that it was watching when I found the rod, but I have thought carefully about the sequence of events, and I believe the circuit of the camp on the 3rd night was a response to that act, that the thing I took was observed to be missing, and that the creature was identifying where it had gone. I believe this. I cannot prove it, but it is the only sequence of cause and effect that explains every element of what I observed, including the moment in the camp when the creature looked at me specifically and I had the rod in my hands. I cannot explain why Taba remained on the beach. I have proposed several possibilities to myself, and discarded all of them as speculative. He was speaking in his island dialect, steadily, as he walked back toward the creature, in the manner of someone conducting a negotiation, rather than someone in flight. Beyond that, I cannot characterize what he was doing. I knew him for 3 weeks, and I will not pretend I knew him well enough to know what he decided in that moment on the beach. I know what he told me the night before we went ashore. He told me the old men called it the place that answers back. I know what he told me on the 3rd day, that everything here is afraid. I know what I watched him do on the beach, which was walk toward the thing, rather than away from it. That is everything I know about what Renang Taba chose in his last minute on that beach. I have nothing more to add by way of technical observation. I will conclude with the following. I have been a surveyor for 10 years. In 10 years of fieldwork, I have measured ground in 4 Australian territories and in 3 international survey zones. I have been in the field in conditions of significant physical danger, and I have returned from all of those situations intact, which I attributed until March of 1911 to professional competence and sound judgment. I do not attribute it to those things any longer, or not entirely, because the professional competence and the sound judgment I brought to this particular survey were not sufficient to bring all 9 men back from that island, and 3 of the reasons for that insufficiency were decisions I made personally, and I have been precise about which 3 they were, because I will not allow them to be attached to anyone else. I returned from the island carrying the rod I had taken from it. Alderton is gone, and Taba is gone, and I have the rod, which is the thing the creature came to the camp for, which is the thing I set down on the beach in the right impulse of the right moment, and then picked up again, because I was running, and I was holding it, and the body does not always follow the decision the mind makes. The Commission has it now. I have asked that it be retained as physical evidence. I do not want it back. I do not want it in any room I occupy. Not because I am superstitious about it. I am a surveyor, and I do not think that way. But because every time I look at it, I see the beach, and the launch, and Taba, standing at the top of the waterline, with the pale thing standing in the morning light behind him. And I see Alderton in the water, 30 yards from the reef, going the wrong direction. And I would like to stop seeing those things, though I have not managed to stop yet, and I do not expect I will. I have given this account under oath, and I stand by every element of it. I have nothing further for this commission.